Well, hello again. This is episode 200. Woohoo! Who would have thought? Here we go. May not be everybody's cup of tea, I just warn you. And we're picking up the narrative today at Matthew 27, verses 24 through to 26. This is basically the end of Jesus' encounter with Pilate, the Roman governor. So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. I have some sympathy with Pilate. He's really between a rock and a hard place. He recognises that there is no evidence against Jesus justifying the death sentence. Yet it's becoming obvious that if he doesn't give in to the cries of the crowd, that a riot is the likely outcome, and that people could well die. It might also result then in an inquiry from the Roman centre, and he may not come out of it too well. So there's an element of him looking after his own self-interest. Why should he put himself out for this Jewish carpenter? So what he does is he shifts responsibility to the crowd. He ceremonially washes his hands and declares himself to be innocent of Jesus' blood. I think it seems a pretty good strategy. And the crowd is happy to go along with this, as long as they get what they want. Yes, they agree. His blood is upon us and upon our children. What a terrible thing to do, eh? To take it upon yourself, but also to hand it to your children. It doesn't seem long, though, that it doesn't take long before they change their minds about this arrangement. In Acts chapter 5 and 28, we read that the religious leaders complain to the apostles whom they have arrested. And this is the words they use. "You have filled Jerusalem with your teaching and determined to make us guilty of this man's blood." Well, hello. I mean, that's what the people put their hands up for. And it's true. We trace through the sermons that the apostles preach, and that's exactly what they do. You go through the early chapters of Acts and it keeps coming back to this again and again and again. So the people ask for it, and they are now being held accountable for that which they committed themselves to. The tragedy, though, is that it didn't stop there. It didn't stop in the first century and just with their own children. It went on and has affected their children's children's children. Throughout the last 2,000 years, the Jewish people have been repeatedly held accountable for the blood of Jesus, often by Christians, referring to them as the Christ killers. And they've paid a high price, perhaps millions of lives and untold misery during the last 2 millennia. Part of the problem is that the willingness to accept responsibility is made in the heat of the moment. And I want to suggest under undetected manipulation by the religious authorities. In one of in one of Peter's sermons, he gives the people a pass on this. He says, "You did this in ignorance." That's what he tells them. And it's true. They did. And this points us to the danger. It's so easy, isn't it, to get caught up by the spirit of the mob, to get swept along by the group emotion and group think without asking the question, is this true? What is true? We hear the speakers and we assume that they're telling the story, the whole story, all of it true. We don't realise that we share the same prejudices and are unaware of the glasses that we are wearing. We're all susceptible to it. We see it so clearly in politics. It's easier, though, to see it in the politics of other countries than in our own. For example, in the US, yes, surprise, surprise, In the US, one of the catchphrases of those opposed to Joe Biden is that he will bring in socialism. And the people often repeating this clearly have no idea what it means. New Zealand, in their minds, would qualify as a socialist country. Thank God for that. We have healthcare. We have education, provided largely free of charge by the taxpayer, by the state. It's rare that one of us will face a life-threatening condition that will drive us to bankruptcy and homelessness in order to pay the medical bills. Yet this is not uncommon in the United States. It's part of the risk of living there. The idea of a safety net where we are one another's keepers is foreign, or it seems to be foreign to the way that they think. It's largely everyone for themselves. And the real tragedy is that they believe that this is the way of Christ. It's the way of freedom. It's the way of personal responsibility. I saw a statistic, it was a couple of years back, that suggested that the USA spends 18% of GDP, gross domestic product, on health care, while we here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, spend 9%. The rich there get the very best of care, while the poor often miss out altogether. And the rationale from many for not extending free healthcare to all is that if I get sick, I'll have to wait because of the queues of undeserving people ahead of me. That's the evil of socialism. And we see the problem of the mob mentality at political rallies with the chant, "Lock her up, lock 'em up." Before I move on to that, let's just go back and pick up the socialism thing again. There's a sense, as I was trying to say, is that it can be a catch cry from people that they spout in ignorance, not understanding what the benefits are. All they can see is what they've been told about the terribleness of it, without actually seeing what it gives. So we come back to the mob mentality, and we've seen it if you've been following the American Senate at all, the chants of lock her up, or lock 'em up, lock 'em up. I saw a speech very recently being given by one of the challengers in the Georgia Senate runoff race currently being conducted. What happens in their system is that if the vote is very close, or if in this case neither candidate got more than 50% of the vote for the Senate race, they have to have a runoff and do it again, a rerun. And this happened in Georgia. The two Georgia seats, neither of the sitting senators got more than 50%, so they're rerunning the race. And one of the challengers is the Democrat, the Reverend Raphael Warnock, who's a black Baptist pastor. And as he was explaining what was going on in the Republican effort to overturn the election in their state, people started to chant, "Lock 'em up," referring to one of the Republican enemies. Warnock immediately shut it down, saying, "We will not become what we oppose." Really, really good advice. It's easy, isn't it, to get caught up with the rage, with the fear of the moment, and they often go together. Our rage often is driven by fear. I get it. I also get angry by what I see as the ignorance of people who are so clearly being duped by those who are wanting to use them for their own ends. Here's the problem. I could be wrong. I could be the one who's being duped. I could be the one who's being manipulated. Of course, I don't believe that. But neither do all the other eyes who see differently from me. So what's the answer? Well, I think the first thing is to take a step back before shooting my mouth off, to be willing to listen, to listening carefully, to do some research, to look across the breadth of the spectrum of views, to seek out that which is fact-based, verifiably fact-based, not just opinion, not just emotive rhetoric, but that which is verifiably true. I've mentioned before the tool of Bayes' theorem, which helps to sift through statistical probabilities of whether things are true or not, or whether this option is better than that one. We don't need to use the mathematical formula to get some benefit from it. Simply being able to apply the kind of thinking that it produces gives us a good tool for testing whether something is likely to be true or not. Now, I'm just going to encourage you to look it up. Spelled Bayes, B-A-Y-E-S, Bayes' theorem. Just Google it, Bayes' theorem, B-A-Y-E-S theorem. It was invented by an 18th century Anglican clergyman who also happened to be a statistician. And it's used extensively in the medical world for determining whether operations and procedures are worth proceeding with, just given statistical probabilities of success or otherwise. So Bayes' theorem. The problem is that we have now, though, is that there is so much stuff coming out, it's impossible to keep up with it all. It's impossible to do all the research. It's impossible to look at all the information. We'd be spending all our time doing it and not getting anything else done. At this point, we may need to be willing to trust reputable investigative sources that have demonstrated integrity in the past. Ones that we've looked at what they've said, we've checked them out, and we see them to be trustworthy. It may be that when we find ourselves caught up in the mob, that the best option is simply to walk away. And that may be easier said than done. So let's draw a line under that bit. Finally, I want to return to the text and do a complete segue to talk about something completely different to finish this episode today. And that is to ask the question, why did Pilate have Jesus flogged? I want to suggest that it could have been simply an act of mercy. Awful though it might sound, it could have been an act of mercy. And I want you to think about the possibility that with the flogging, that Jesus is in a sense softening, that Pilate is in a sense softening Jesus up for the awfulness of crucifixion. When I was at theological college, I dislocated a small toe. It was my second smallest toe. I ended up on Christmas Eve in 1988, I think it was, in Auckland Hospital, facing surgery. They, in the end, offered me alternatives, and I elected for a epidural as a form of anaesthesia, which actually blocks everything from the waist down. You can't feel a thing from the waist down. And an epidural, it is what is very commonly used with women in childbirth. And what I found was it was a very unpleasant experience. It was quick but unpleasant. They stick a needle in the back of my spine. I had to roll forward and they put a needle in. And it reminded me of Dad's Army, of Corporal Jones. His catch cry was, "They don't like the cold steel up 'em, Captain Mannering." And it felt like someone had stuck a big cold knife right up my backside. It was unpleasant. What I noticed though was that when Lynette had it, she never complained about that. She was in the middle of childbirth, she was in excruciating pain, and my hunch is she didn't even notice because the pain of the other stuff was just so bad. Well, I'm just a wuss of a male, so I noticed. And I've been thinking about that with relation to Jesus being flogged. And I wondered whether it's just a way of being able to prepare him for the awfulness of having those horrible, heavy nail spikes driven through his wrists or his hands and through his feet. That he was already now, his whole body was singing with pain. That although he would have noticed it, it might not have been as acute. Anyway, maybe in Pilate's thinking, and I'm not just wanting to give him the pass, but I'm thinking in his thinking it may have been seen as an act of mercy, awful though it sounds. Well, if it's possible, God bless you.